much. Welcome to The Beat. Tonight we have a special report right now on the core rights and liberty protections the Trump administration has been both attacking and very brazenly testing in the highest courts in the land. The push begins with Trump's mass deportation agenda, the people being hauled on and off planes and sent to various parts and corners of the world, but it doesn't necessarily stop there. This has actually drawn a string of losses in federal courts, rebukes from multiple judges, orders to bring back, sometimes wrongly, deported individuals. There's been the Supreme Court losses in the early rounds. You're probably familiar with some of that, but as Donald Trump keeps pushing, we now have this standoff between him and the courts, as the Wall Street Journal reports, and this is the current baseline. And these clashes already go beyond even the tense standoffs over foreign detainee rules during the war on terror. We're past where we were then under Trump in the second term. And the president's challenge is to the law and the Constitution in a way that could go even farther than those clashes. Indeed, Trump's number 2 official in the White House, Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller, has asserted, he says the administration is mulling ways to suspend the core long-standing liberty right against unlawful or unlimited government detention powers that they claim they're already looking at how to suspend habeas corpus.
The Constitution is clear, and that, of course, is the supreme law of the land, that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended in a time of invasion. So I would say that's an option we're actively looking at. Look, a lot of it depends on whether the courts do the right thing or not.
That's their stance. They're, quote, actively looking at it, and then he adds a kind of a bluster toward the courts. Be careful, if you don't do the, quote, right thing, which means agree with Trump on just about everything, maybe they'll suspend this right. Now, in our special report right now, I want to be very clear about this baseline. In any era in American history, claims to suspend that core right of the Constitution are a huge deal. That Latin phrase, habeas corpus, is one of the most important and vital rights that people have in their dealings with the government. The founders were clear that that right would operate in the Constitution, so no politician and no Congress can repeal it, and it would operate permanently to limit government powers against the people. That is the baseline. And while, yes, there are times where you might have an actual emergency or a world war, that would also be enumerated. You can't just suspend the right because you don't like dissent or you have a different immigration policy. It could only be done, suspended in the case of wartime invasion or emergency public safety. That's what it says in the Constitution. It means something good. It means most presidents have never even gone near suspending it or even talking about how they could. That's even after obviously shared public safety disasters and emergencies like the 9/11 attacks. And while Mr. Miller could be exaggerating, political aides have been known to do that. On the deportation front, let's draw a direct line to his threat and what the administration has already done. Rush to formally claim war powers in those first 100 days, a period where Americans do know, whether you follow all this stuff closely or not, that there was no declared war or new war. But that's part of the asserted war powers that the new president in his second term tried to assert by citing the old Wartime Alien Enemies Act, which judges then rejected because there's no war on the southern border. And the White House, as one judge put it, failed to prove any invasion. Now, the history here is instructive. America's had its share of wars and obviously related to that, intense debates about both wars themselves, whether to start them, where to wage them, and then the attendant powers that come alongside big wars. Protests over those war powers or government overreach. Consider the huge power of drafting people into battle, which is part of what animated the wider opposition to Vietnam. Debates over how the U.S. treats people abroad during war, whether it follows human rights. And I want to turn with you to history's lessons tonight because this is a very important thing we're going to be living through. Some of them have possibly bad news for Trump's claims through his DOJ lawyers. But the current clashes are telling as the administration is not exactly shy about its claims that it can suspend rights, something they say they may do further, or that they have war powers. In fact, we just pressed top administration border czar Tom Homan about this. Another judge said the White House failed to prove the existence of the invasion or conflict required to justify invoking that act. You've been blocked from using those wartime powers.
You don't have to be at war with the alien enemies. They also can be a predatory incursion. That's what we believe happened.
Mr. Homan, I'll tell you, so you have the benefit of knowing this is a Texas-appointed judge. I have the quote on the screen. This term invaded concerns warfare. So not people crossing what you're calling predatory. But anyway, my key point to you is now the Supreme Court limited that. You're going to follow that unless and until the courts change it. Is that correct?
Of course we won't follow the Supreme Court.
Now, this is playing out at the Supreme Court, and it has allowed certain types of deportations while requiring actual real due process. And remember, the founders were concerned, as we're going to see, that wherever you set the minimum line, it's going to have implications, because wherever the minimum is what some people will go through if the government accuses you, for example, of being here unlawfully. Now, Justice Sotomayor has warned about some of these problems, saying citizens under the Trump claims could be taken off the streets, forced onto planes. And again, I'm going to leave this up for a moment because she says U.S. citizens. She's talking to the public and the Trump administration. And for those who say, oh, well, this is only for unlawful migrants or new people who came here, she knows how things work. She understands the law, and then says this: history is no stranger to such lawless regimes, but this nation's system of laws is designed to prevent, not enable their rise. Sotomayor discussing the centuries that have led up to these protections that guarantee these rights for citizens. In fact, you can trace it back all the way from before this country was founded in the rebellion we've all learned about, the revolution we all study against kings and their kingly abuses of power. You can go all the way back to about 13th century England and the Magna Carta, which was the initial attempt to try to have some sort of peace between what was then an unpopular king, because a lot of times when you ask the people, they don't like these kings, and some rebels. And there was the idea that it would be a bartered way to have at least a basic protection from illegal imprisonment. Now, that is a ways back. The world operated completely differently. The notion of who was even a full human and what rights were and whether kings were ruling from godlike decrees was a different time. But even then, this is my point to you tonight as we think about whether folks want to take us backwards in history, the basic line of human rights was the idea that they would start checking the king's power, which began with detaining people and then maybe exiling or murdering them, and that there had to be some due process.
I would ask you to deliver this message to France, given your familiarity with its recipient. But I believe in the morning you be otherwise engaged.
Pray how, my liege?
Tomorrow you will have your heads cut off.
That's how it worked. I'd throw you into prison, cut off your head. That's how kings ruled. They didn't have much popular support, which is why so many of them had to kill so much. And the Magna Carta was drawing on what you've heard referenced lately, what Mr. Miller seems to be intent upon right now. The core protection against the government just detaining you forever for no reason, habeas corpus. In Latin, it means you have the body, produce the body, that there has to be due process and you can't just take the body and throw it into a prison without any court process. Now, this was then made official in England later under the Habeas Corpus Act. That was in the late 1600s. It was passed by a parliament to protect these sort of rights and to establish that you could petition your imprisonment and laying out how to do so. Now, you take this together and you say, all right, a lot of history. Why do we have to go back so far? But one of the key points that brings us up to today is how that baseline of history actually was the core protection. Now, the political attack, some of it could be rhetoric. Could be that Trump has aides who say this stuff and don't ever actually try to act on it. And Trump officials at least under questioning, have conceded that judicial rulings are the law and they will follow them. And that normally wouldn't be very notable, but we are dealing with these detention debates now over what rights will attach. And this is the founding principle which separates rule by the people, which we now call democracy, from the oppression by the kings you just saw. So the founders viewed these rights against just wanton detention as sacrosanct. They viewed them along with the rights to vote or to speak, and that you have to have these all together if you're going to have people exercising meaningful democracy to hold rulers accountable. Either you have them or you don't. And so here we are in 2025 talking about a very powerful official in Mr. Miller saying, maybe you don't have them. Maybe they will suspend them. And remember, kings could, at that time, before we got these rights, they could just crush anything they didn't like by detaining, deporting, or crushing dissent. So you could try to have peaceful dissent, but if you were just going to be jailed for it, well, you don't have much of a democracy. The exception, as I mentioned, was for, in the United States context, the actual example of an invading army or a rebellion. The founders referred to that as rebellion or invasion. And America's Constitution proved to be a model for other nations here. The Bill of Rights chiefly focuses on thwarting that very temptation that even if we make some progress, a president could still revert to trying to rule like a king. You don't see the world's Donald Trump in these protections, but they're in the news tonight because that's exactly why you had these protections. That a politician could win power in an election, but then use it to oppress and end meaningful democracy. Now, let's be clear. In politics, ideology shifts over time. Take one example. Richard Nixon, he was a foreign policy hawk, but on the environment, he was a dove. He would look lefty and not even be probably welcomed in today's GOP on those issues. So some stuff goes back and forth, but the founders' priorities on core rights are supposed to endure the protections against the autocratic big government repression. And if you check the Bill of Rights, you will find that most of them are powers for the people, to be as clear as possible, for you, against who's ever in charge of your big federal government. The people's right to speak and assemble, people's right to resist soldiers being put in your homes, which was a big issue back then, maybe not as much today, a right to bear arms. Those are rights that are supposed to fortify that detention protection, the habeas right. And it's something that today's justices, appointed by both parties, by the way, are actually upholding against Donald Trump's early efforts. The Bill of Rights protects against unlawful searches, which could supercharge detention powers, right? If you can search everyone anytime with no oversight, sooner or later you might find something that justifies their detention. So that's why you need a warrant. The Bill of Rights sets a rule against abusing bail and setting it so high that people are stuck in jail. It also protects a right to the fair trial you're supposed to get pursuant to that bail. Now, why are we talking about this at the top of the newscast? To be clear, President Trump has not yet said that he will take all of those rights from American citizens. Not yet. But he's already chipping away at this system, which is why the Supreme Court and multiple Trump appointees are ruling against him in the early rounds. That's how far you have to go to get those kind of rulings. And he's doing it by going at new immigrants, people who are potentially here unlawfully, then starting to try to chip away at this for citizens with some sort of foreign tie or some other objection. And then his aides are talking up, chucking the whole system of these rights for all Americans by suspending it, as Miller said. It's actively looking at it. They may do it, he says, he claims. So you can see how today's wannabe kings could sound. Now, we don't have video to show you from the founders, of course, only their manuscripts, but there are fictionalized versions that have brought the core points to light. And so I play this now with everything I just presented to you. Keep in mind what Trump is trying to do, not as criticism, but literally what his top aides and his lawyers are arguing for, those wartime powers. And remember that it was this American Revolution that specifically was rejecting exactly that. Politicians or would-be kings who care only for their power, not justice.
These acts strip us of our rights, Jonathan, our rights. The power of self-government the replacement of court officers loyal to the crown. Are we considered too young, too unprincipled to understand justice?
The crown has ruled, John. The only reasonable course left is obedience, and you do well to remember that and act accordingly, old friend.
Not much has changed since then, but these issues endure. Consider that arbitrary imprisonments across basically, quote, all ages were considered the favorite and most formidable instruments of tyranny. That's Alexander Hamilton warning against exactly the clash we're witnessing today. Imprisonment, its use or abuse when arbitrary. And this is what got us the due process and the reference to habeas that I'm reminding you about, the Fifth Amendment, that no one can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. No person. That due process attaches even if you have a parking ticket or a tax claim, or you might be here unlawfully. You get some sort of due process so that we don't all have everyone just being mistreated like whatever the lowest category the government says. In the 14th Amendment, you see the due process clause again, and that has been used to apply to the states. And over time, the courts expanded rather than limited that. And the Supreme Court has used that baseline I'm telling you about in the modern era to do what, again, people in both parties ultimately saw as necessary to make due process mean something. In fact, in the early 60s, a time of great change, there was the famous case of Gideon, who faced a robbery arrest, couldn't afford an attorney, and the Supreme Court unanimously sided with that individual that his rights and due process had been violated by the government, which is separate from whether he did something wrong. The due process is to ensure we get it right for everyone. We do it fairly. And then after that, people can still get in trouble, be convicted, and the rest. And that ruling said the right of one charged with crime to counsel may not be deemed fundamental and essential to fair trials in some countries, meaning they're saying, hey, you can do it how you want over there, but in America, it is fundamental in ours. Or take Miranda rights. Anyone who's ever watched a cop show knows about them, Reading Your Rights, named after Ernesto Miranda, who was not given any reading or meaningful information of his constitutional right. You've all heard it, the right to remain silent. And without being given that, the courts found that not being told about that or right to an attorney violated these core rights. The Supreme Court again, which remember tends to be the older, more establishment lawyers who've made it all the way up there, but they said, yes, officers must at least take a couple moments to meaningfully inform defendants of those rights, what we now forevermore call Miranda rights.
You are under arrest. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of the law.
You have the right to remain silent.
I bought him. Talk to my lawyer.
You have the right to an attorney.
You forgot to read him his Miranda rights. What possible reason is there for not doing the only thing you have to do when arresting someone?
The last one there, a comedy, making the point that it's a pretty bare bones thing. You have these rights, you tell them, and you keep it moving. But they are there because the government in the modern era, through all this progress, has to follow some of that due process. So why are we talking about American citizens and unanimous court rulings if the Trump administration has claimed this is only just for certain unlawful gang members? The answer when we're back in 90 seconds. Continuing with our special report on the beat right now, we've been looking at how America got to the place of securing what has been a long-running, multi-hundred-year sacrosanct right that's only been fortified or built up over time against governments or king-like politicians' desires to abuse detention powers. Now, there are moments, to be sure, where those rights that I've been telling you about have indeed been suspended. After Pearl Harbor, which was the actual World War that most legal experts say is the kind of thing, unlike a fake war or fake invasion, that can trigger certain enhanced presidential powers, there were great fears of how the Japanese opponents and enemies might come in or abuse situations in the U.S. And so there was an executive order that actually didn't work very well, according to most folks who's ever looked into this and historians, seen as kind of a panic of the time, although it also was an existential world war scenario. But it basically made a giant over-inclusive category and tried to take people of any Japanese descent without any other security analysis and put them into internment camps in the U.S. And the Supreme Court ruled in Korematsu that that was at the time in war a national security constitutional act. So that's what it looked like in one of the rare times this has happened. But most scholars, legal experts, and even many military experts say that that was not the right call with all the facts in. And if you go to law school and you talk to judges, including many Federalist Society, conservative judges, and legal experts, they say it's one of the worst Supreme Court decisions ever. Here's President Reagan, who issued an apology for the action.
120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry living in the United States were forcibly removed from their homes and placed in makeshift internment camps. This action was taken without trial, without jury. It was based solely on race. Yet we must recognize that the internment of Japanese Americans was just that, a mistake.
A mistake as policy. And legally, well, again, in the moment, you can say it was lawful in the sense that some bad things are lawful at the time, but it is not a precedent that any serious mainstream figure in law or military expertise has pointed to for support in a long time. Reagan even established a Civil Liberties Act, which acknowledged what he called that mistake and injustice. Now, Trump's Solicitor General John Sauer actually brought this up during his confirmation hearing in agreement with the idea that it was a mistake.
I believe there was a court order there that upheld, which has now been, I think, correctly repudiated by virtually everyone, a court order that upheld the internment of Japanese civilians in internment camps during.
As bad as it was, that court order was followed for years, was it not?
And I just wonder whether some historians might think we'd be better off if it hadn't been followed.
He wonders, in that example, if that abuse of government detention power should have not been followed. This is why they call it clever lawyering, because he works for an administration that has gone farther, not as far as Korematsu, nobody's saying that, but has gone farther than other administrations to stretch wartime detention powers, claiming a war right now, and then he's citing that in the opposite. Now, Trump wants to deport more people, and there are many ways he can do that that are constitutional. But he's also sending out lawyers to push the courts past the very lines they draw. And there's some very clear hypocrisy on the record. Take the pandemic we all lived through. Just 5 years back, it was many conservative Republicans who looked at COVID restrictions, which did, of course, restrict Americans and other individuals' liberty to some degree temporarily. And they, at the time, made the very arguments that they now resist against far graver due process violations on behalf of Trump's deportation agenda.
If you're now an American citizen living in Florida that wants to travel, they're going to put some form of restriction in your way. I mean, it's clearly unconstitutional. I don't understand what the confusion is. This individual is a citizen of El Salvador. He was illegally in the United States and was returned to his country.
The pandemic has resulted in previously unimaginable restrictions on individual liberty.
Justice Samuel Alito criticizing a SCOTUS ruling pausing the deportation of Venezuelan men. Alito says that the court behaved hastily and prematurely.
How do you have the authority to order something that so clearly contravenes the Bill of Rights of the United States, the U.S. Constitution? I am for due process specifically for me. I'm not that concerned whether someone who broke my law to get into my country and is taking welfare from my pocket gets due process.
Due process for, quote, me, not for them or you. But that's the whole point. Remember, due process attaches regardless of what someone's accused of, because that's the whole point. And there are people who've been convicted of terrible things, all the way up, including murder, who under our system are entitled to due process. And murderers, whatever their nationality, obviously by the end of the process, you feel a lot of judgment of them. But they get the due process along the way. And a lot of reasonable people would say a murderer is worse than an unlawful migrant, even if both broke different rules. So there you have the conservatives who are on record quite recently in a real world example saying Bill of Rights, due process rules, COVID objections. And now they're going soft. They're going wobbly, some of them, sweeping other people's rights to the side, sometimes admitting as a matter of rhetoric or perhaps confession that they just want to do it selectively. And if you want to do it selectively, then you don't support human rights because they are for all humans. That's why what we're hearing from about deportation, and this will only apply to them or maybe a few more of them or even more, but maybe not you, is getting the whole thing backwards. There's either baseline protections in the Bill of Rights that protects people against government overreach, including the abuse of detention powers that the founders were concerned about from the beginning. Either we have that or we don't. We bring in federal prosecutor and counselor John Flannery on this next. We're back with former federal prosecutor John Flannery. John, we went deeper into history from before the founding of this nation to look at the baseline due process rights, the concern about detention abuse, and how that's been fortified over time. What do you think it's important to understand about all this?
I think, first of all, that you've made a dramatic assessment that's been contradicted falsely by the administration. So I think what you've done is a public service. Of course, that is what you do. But the next thing I would think is we should emphasize a couple of aspects of what you've mentioned. First of all, I have my copy of the Constitution here. I don't always carry it with me, but I have several dog-eared copies. And it says the privilege, as you posted, of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. It is important where that is placed in the Constitution. It is placed in the first article, which is the powers of Congress. So when the White House says, we're going to suspend habeas corpus, we're thinking about it, they can't. Congress has to do it. Now, this may be a test of courage, and we are familiar with the fact that JFK's Profiles in Courage is a thin volume. And so over the course of our history, sometimes we haven't found as many courageous, if you will, people to do what they're supposed to do. But the first point is the White House can't do this. Only Congress can. And hell's to be paid should they choose to do that, I think. The next thing that I think is worth talking about is when we talk about the amendments to the Constitution that were written because Patrick Henry said, you guys decided this Constitution behind closed doors. We want certain rights guaranteed to us. And when we talk about the Fifth Amendment, we talk about the rights for a person, meaning you don't have to be a citizen to enjoy that right. And when habeas corpus is invoked because a right is violated, of course, it's due process. I want to know what the charges are. I want to have a chance to rebut them because my freedom's at stake. But it seems to me the way this administration has acted, you also have the amendment that involves cruelty. Because if we're sending people to a hell prison that shouldn't be there because we didn't give them due process, it strikes me that's another problem. If they can't have access to the court, a First Amendment right, that should also be a part of the abuse that the individuals suffer who've been cleaned up and taken out of the country.
And let me jump in and say, is it a tell? Is it revealing when people say out loud, oh, yeah, these rights are good, but they should only be for my group or my team?
Yes, well, the campaign of the gentleman in the White House is against individual rights, period. He has a belief in a set of insiders and so forth. We see this at you have to pay $1 million to get a pardon, for example. You have to come to a party and nobody's going to know who the guest list is. And this goes on and on. So we start with this. And the notion of our country from the Declaration of Independence was that we were all equal and that we were equal before the law. And the Constitution in its prefatory language says, we, the people, we, all of us, no divisions, no separations. These rights are for all of us. And if there's any war that settled that question, still with the tension we have today, it's the Civil War and the 14th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment said you can't even have badges of slavery, which is distinguishing you or me from someone else by the group that we're in.
Yeah. Here's Donald Trump, where he does continue to claim he wants to follow the rules. Like, that's one of their talking points, while also going at due process.
Your Secretary of State says everyone who's here, citizens and non-citizens, deserve due process. Do you agree, Mr. President?
I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but if you're talking about that, then we'd have to have 1 million or 2 million or 3 million trials.
Don't you need to uphold the Constitution of the United States as president?
I don't know. I have to respond by saying again, I have brilliant lawyers that work for me, and they are going to obviously follow what the Supreme Court said.
That's what he said. The Borders are said something to me similar under questioning. What does it mean that Roberts has teamed up now with Democratic appointees and Trump appointees to say, we got to fight this out on the immigration rules before they come for whoever the next group would be?
I think that Roberts is concerned about his legacy, and I think Barrett is as well. And that I think it's easier to be in opposition to Thomas and other members of the court that side with Trump than it is to resist the, quote, liberals, the 3 liberals on the court. And I think that when we have a chief executive who says he doesn't know about a critical issue in which he's moving people around a world stage and putting them in places where they might suffer death, and were chosen and are there without any belief or proof that they actually did anything that would justify such imprisonment, I think that's an international war crime, frankly, that you could choose sections of our society, and we don't know how many citizens are in those groups that they've been moving offshore, and we don't know how many people in there even have a basic violation of any of our immigration laws, and yet they're there. So Trump, he plays dumb. Somebody else says, I don't know what habeas corpus is. And this is very similar, these lawyers, the way they're acting, the way they acted when they were accusing fraud across the country. Went into courts with the same kind of crazy arguments that didn't work, and that's what's happening now. We take the people who were his lawyers defending against the prosecutions, righteous prosecutions of him, and he puts them in charge of this now to counter the law as it is, the Constitution as it is, and denigration of equality among all of us. So I think that the biggest problem we have is that the Congress has lost its voice, both parties. And the Democrats I am particularly upset with because I consider myself a genetic Democrat. So what we have, though, is we have attorneys general across the United States. We have Google groups. We have the people resisting, and we have the court. That is
and you have the people, as you say, you have the people concerned, and interestingly, you have the court, but people also need to know just how extreme this is. I have to fit in a break, although we tried to give this the time we think it warrants, and John, we hope to hear from you again soon.
Thank you. Glad to
Appreciate
be here.
it. We are going to fit in a break. We have an update on the crypto issues and the conflicts of interest next. President Trump has long derided crypto as a, quote, scam. Now, his blatant efforts to profit off crypto virtual currency while serving as president and overseeing regulations and enforcement of that industry are drawing ethical concerns and questions about corruption and scandal. Here is the latest. You may think you've heard about this. He did the dinner last week, but they're going bigger. Donald Trump's media company wants to buy billions in Bitcoin. The latest move by companies partly owned by Trump and his family to invest in cryptocurrency. The Times reporting on this, and it comes days after that private dinner. The problem is that you have a sitting president with all of this power over the entities that are supposed to regulate crypto now standing to benefit from it. And that's raising questions about alleged corruption and how much worse the self-dealing can get with 3+ years left in office. We're going to fit in a break, but when it comes to the beat, we always love our time with James Carville and the movie that made him, The War Room. Next, we have the filmmaker behind that classic documentary. There's more places to watch TV and videos and movies than ever, and there's now more documentaries than ever. The appetite for these basically true stories that follow interesting or extraordinary people is growing with the platforms we have. Take this one here of the singer Billie Eilish and her collaborations with her talented music brother Phineas, or Martha Stewart. A whole doc about the incredible rise, fall, and rise again of that entrepreneur. Both those films are by R.J. Cutler, who produced a film near and dear to so many politicos, The War Room, which brought James Carville, then a behind-the-scenes figure, to a national audience. The filmmaker, R.J. Cutler, joins us. You mentioned that Martha Stewart made a range of public comments. She participated, but one of her criticisms, I guess, you can respond again, I'm sure you've dealt with this before, was her view that for her life and how much she's done and how much she's overcome, and being a trailblazing woman, that the proportion of the prison chapter, which many critics say with regard to the DOJ, has not aged well in terms of their priority set. Now, you're just telling the story. You didn't prosecute her. But her critique was that the film, your work, overdid that chapter. What do you say to that, and what do you think of her overall range of comments, having also participated in the thing?
Well, I have great admiration for Martha, and the film has great admiration for Martha. And I think it was incredibly courageous for her to open up her life and to sit with me for the several days that she did of interviews, and to open up her archive. And I'm incredibly proud of that film. And I know she is too. And I guess I'm not surprised that she would have made a different film than I made. And maybe she would have emphasized less the prosecution at the hands of James Comey, by the way. But the film really argues that it was a selective prosecution, and that Martha was singled out not only for being a successful woman, but because she was famous, and it's and listen. As I say, I think somewhere between 30 and 40 million people watched that film, which is just a thrill for us.
That's something that all storytelling, including journalism, has in common, which is sometimes the source, the subject, the first reaction on day one or two can be different than a year later as the overall thing plays out. Not that it's your job or a journalist's job to satisfy everyone. We showed you Elton John. You did this incredible Billie Eilish documentary when we had her brother Phineas in here, because they make music together in a really impressive way. We showed him some clips from your doc. He particularly liked how you made the family dog a character. He thought that was true to the family experience, which again goes to how you were telling a story that was both actual musical prodigies in the real literal definition of that word, who were also by definition children and adolescents, who also are homeschooled with their parents, who also have a dog, and you captured something there, which for those of us who are music fans, we appreciate, and also shows your range.
Thank you.
From politics to music. As we always say around here on The Beat, you have to pick one. You cannot do both. But here's a scene from this project, The World's a Little Blurry, where Billie's talking about her process.
This is what I want the album to be called. When we all fall asleep, where do we go? I also want to do something where I drink black liquid and then my eyes turn black and then I start bleeding black out of my eyes. My limbs all frozen. Can't feel my toes.
Can't feel my toes is not cool enough.
No, it's not.
Tell us
you're
about
watching them.
in
You're
this
watching
process.
them.
Yeah, but tell us specifically, different from so many other projects where people are more formed. Carville's in his 40s. Elton John has been Elton John for a minute. How you did this in such an intimate setting with the family. And I'm curious how you both built trust and also thought about your journalistic, documentary, ethical obligations in dealing with minors and telling their story with what I think you did achieve, frankly, which is with grace.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, I'm so proud of that film and loved working with Billie and Phineas and Maggie and Patrick, their parents, and Pepper the dog, and everybody in their orbit. And it's true that they're kids coming of age. And the day I met them, that was very evident to me. But it was also very evident to me that they were remarkable artists. It was almost as if, you know, they were partially aliens from another land, and then at the same time, the realest kids I had ever met. And what happens when your kids come of age? And, you know, on some level, all of us with daughters feel like our daughters are Billie Eilish. We recognize their greatness, their their inner poets, and yet at the same time, there are kids. And that's why this film, I believe, has a richness, because it's a movie about family, and it's a movie about having children, and it's a movie about these remarkable two artists, Phineas and Billy, and you see them, as you saw in that scene, you see them writing these songs that are now legendary, pop hits. You never get to see that.
Our discussion with the documentarian R.J. Cutler of The War Room and Martha and so many other projects. Go to msnbc.com/Ari. msnbc.com/ARI takes you to our MSNBC YouTube page where you can see that and other recent interviews. Thanks for watching.